When people first hear the word certification exam, they often imagine a mysterious test that only insiders can decode, and that feeling of mystery is exactly what we want to remove right away. The AI audit world can sound intimidating because it blends technology, governance, and risk thinking, but an exam is still just an exam, a structured way to check whether you can recognize concepts, apply judgment, and communicate like an auditor would. The goal here is not to turn you into a working auditor overnight, and it is definitely not to make you memorize trivia that has nothing to do with real audit work. Instead, this orientation helps you understand what the AAIA exam experience is like, what kinds of thinking it rewards, what it will not reward, and how to approach it calmly even if you are brand new to cybersecurity and new to AI. Once you know the format, the timing pressure becomes manageable, the rules stop feeling scary, and you can focus on learning the actual material rather than worrying about surprises. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful way to think about the AAIA exam is that it is testing your ability to reason about AI as something that lives inside an organization, not as a magical box that sits on a shelf. An auditor's job is to evaluate whether something is designed sensibly, controlled appropriately, monitored consistently, and aligned to requirements, risks, and ethical expectations. That means the exam will lean toward questions that ask you to interpret a situation, recognize what matters most, and choose the best next step based on audit priorities. It will not be satisfied with answers that sound impressive but ignore governance basics like accountability, documentation, and risk ownership. If you come from a beginner background, you might worry that you need to know advanced math or coding, but the exam is far more interested in whether you can ask the right questions and spot missing controls than whether you can build a model from scratch. Your job is to develop the mindset of someone who can examine AI activities and say, with confidence, what should be verified, what evidence would matter, and what risks need to be addressed. Timing matters because even a well-prepared learner can get rattled when the clock is visible, so it helps to train your brain to work in calm, repeatable cycles. Most multiple-choice exams reward steady pacing rather than bursts of speed, because overthinking a single question can silently steal time from several easier questions later. A good mental approach is to treat the exam as a long series of small decisions, each one made with a clear method. Read the question, identify what it is truly asking, eliminate clearly wrong options, then select the best remaining choice based on audit logic. When you build that habit, timing becomes less about racing and more about staying consistent. Another key idea is that the exam is designed to include questions that feel close, where more than one answer sounds reasonable, and the clock pressure can tempt you into guessing too early. The best defense is a pacing plan that gives you permission to move on and return later if needed, rather than becoming emotionally attached to one tricky question. Rules and test day conditions also matter because they shape what you can bring into the room and how you should prepare mentally. You want to walk into the exam expecting a controlled environment that is designed to prevent cheating, which can feel strict even when you are doing everything right. That strictness is not personal, and it is not meant to intimidate you, but it can distract you if you are not expecting it. In many certification testing situations, you may have identity checks, restrictions on personal items, and monitoring measures that can include camera observation or in-room proctors, depending on the testing method. The skill you are practicing here is composure, because composure protects your thinking accuracy. When your brain feels watched or rushed, it tends to read sloppily and miss key words like best, most, first, or primary, and those words often determine the correct answer. Treat the rules as background noise, follow them carefully, and keep your attention on the question in front of you. Now let's talk about what gets tested in a way that is actually useful for beginners who have never audited anything. Auditing, at its core, is about comparing what is happening against what should be happening, and then judging the gap. That means the exam will test your understanding of how AI systems are conceived, designed, built, deployed, and monitored, but always through the lens of verification and assurance. You will be expected to understand basic AI concepts well enough to ask sharp questions, such as what data was used, how performance was evaluated, and what risks were considered before deployment. You will also be expected to understand governance and oversight enough to recognize whether there is a clear owner, whether decisions are documented, and whether controls exist to prevent harm. Even when a question references technical terms, the point is often to see whether you understand what evidence would demonstrate that the system is behaving as intended. In other words, the exam tests judgment more than it tests vocabulary, even though vocabulary still matters as a tool for clear thinking. Because the AAIA is an audit-oriented certification, many questions will be framed around tasks and decisions rather than purely definitions. You may be asked what an auditor should do first when evaluating an AI initiative, or what kind of evidence best supports a conclusion, or what risk deserves the most attention based on a scenario. This is where beginners often get tripped up because they treat every question like a school quiz instead of an audit decision. In an audit mindset, first steps usually involve understanding context, scope, and objectives, because you cannot judge controls if you do not know what the system is supposed to do and what boundaries apply. Evidence-oriented answers tend to beat opinion-oriented answers because audits rely on artifacts like requirements, logs, approvals, monitoring outputs, and documented processes. Another common pattern is that risk-based prioritization matters, meaning the best answer is not always the one that sounds most thorough, but the one that addresses the highest impact risk first. Learning to think in these patterns will make the test feel fairer and more predictable. A common misconception is that AI auditing is mainly about catching bias, and while bias is important, the real world is broader than that. An AI system can fail because of poor data quality, unclear requirements, weak oversight, unsafe deployment decisions, inadequate monitoring, or hidden dependencies that no one considered. The exam will likely probe your awareness that risk can come from technical causes and organizational causes at the same time. For example, a model can have acceptable accuracy in a lab, but behave dangerously in a real environment because the data in production looks different. That is not just a technical problem, because it is also a governance problem if no one defined acceptable performance thresholds and monitoring triggers. Another example is that a vendor-provided AI component might be introduced without adequate due diligence, creating supply chain risks and visibility gaps. The exam wants you to see these interconnected issues and select answers that reflect responsible oversight rather than narrow technical fixes. Another place beginners stumble is confusing what the exam is testing with what the AI industry loves to talk about. The industry loves shiny terms and dramatic claims, but auditors care about traceability, accountability, and control evidence. You do not earn points for repeating hype words, and you do not lose points for using plain language, as long as your reasoning is correct. If a question asks about evaluating an AI system, the best answer is often the one that asks for documented requirements, data provenance, validation results, and monitoring plans, not the one that suggests adding more complexity. If a question asks about governance, the best answer is often the one that clarifies roles, approvals, and escalation paths, not the one that says build a committee without authority. It also helps to remember that many exam questions include distractor answers that sound proactive but are not audit-focused, like jumping straight to redesigning the model. Auditors typically identify issues, assess impact, confirm root causes with evidence, and recommend controls or remediation rather than immediately rebuilding systems. Because the exam is timed, reading strategy becomes part of your skill set, and it can be practiced even while learning the content. A reliable method is to read the last line of the question first, because that line often tells you what decision you are being asked to make. Then read the rest of the question and underline it mentally by repeating the key constraint in your head, such as first step, best evidence, highest risk, or most appropriate control. This keeps you from being pulled into interesting details that are not actually relevant. When you look at the answer choices, pay attention to words that signal scope and certainty, such as always, never, only, or must, because extreme language is often a clue that an option is too rigid. At the same time, do not assume extreme language is always wrong, because audit standards sometimes do require firm actions in specific contexts. The point is to slow down just enough to be accurate, without slowing down so much that you lose time. It also helps to understand how exams typically balance straightforward knowledge checks with applied judgment questions. Straightforward questions often test whether you know what a term means, what a basic process step is called, or what a general concept implies. Applied questions often give you a scenario where multiple actions could be taken, and you must decide which action is best for an auditor in that moment. Beginners tend to get discouraged when they miss applied questions, thinking they lack knowledge, when the real issue is that they have not yet learned the audit perspective. The audit perspective values independence, documentation, and evidence, so answers that rely on informal conversations or assumptions are usually weaker than answers that rely on documented artifacts. It also values scope control, so answers that try to solve everything at once can be less correct than answers that set boundaries and prioritize. As you study, you want to practice translating each question into a simple statement like, I am being asked to choose the most audit-appropriate action, not the most technically impressive action. Let's make the idea of what gets tested more concrete with an example that stays beginner-friendly. Imagine an organization wants to use an AI system to help screen job applicants, and they claim it improves efficiency. An auditor does not start by debating whether AI is good or bad, and they do not start by trying to rewrite the model. They start by asking what the system is supposed to do, what data it uses, what success looks like, and what safeguards exist. They would look for requirements that specify fairness goals, accuracy targets, and decision boundaries, and they would look for evidence that the system was tested on relevant data. They would ask whether there is a process to review decisions, handle appeals, and monitor for drift over time. A test question might ask what evidence best supports the claim that the system is appropriate, and the best answer would likely involve documented validation and monitoring plans rather than a stakeholder's opinion. Notice how this example is about reasoning with governance and evidence, not about needing to know complicated mathematics. Another key part of exam orientation is understanding how to handle uncertainty without panicking, because uncertainty is built into many questions. When you feel uncertain, it usually means the question is testing prioritization or best practice rather than factual recall. In those moments, returning to audit fundamentals can save you, because fundamentals act like a compass. Ask yourself which option strengthens accountability, improves traceability, reduces high-impact risk, or increases the reliability of evidence. If an option says to define requirements, document assumptions, or establish monitoring and escalation, that often aligns with audit priorities. If an option says to trust the vendor, accept results because they look good, or move forward without clear ownership, that often conflicts with audit thinking. This does not mean every question has an obvious answer, but it does mean there is usually an answer that is more consistent with audit logic. Training yourself to fall back on that logic is one of the most practical exam skills you can develop. Finally, it is worth clarifying the difference between studying content and studying the exam itself, because you need both, but you should not confuse them. Studying content means learning what AI is, how it is developed and used, what risks show up, and what governance practices help manage those risks. Studying the exam means learning how questions are worded, how scenarios are framed, and how to keep your pace steady without getting derailed. In this course, the content will do most of the heavy lifting, because strong content knowledge makes exam strategy easier. Still, the exam has its own personality, and the better you understand that personality, the less energy you waste on anxiety. Think of exam skills as a wrapper around your knowledge, not a substitute for it. A good wrapper helps your knowledge show up clearly under pressure, which is exactly what time testing demands. As you move forward from this orientation into the actual learning topics, keep one steady idea in mind. The exam is measuring whether you can think like someone who provides assurance about AI systems, not whether you can build them. That means you are learning a way of seeing, where AI is not just technology, but a chain of decisions that can be evaluated. You will learn the basic language of models and learning types so you can ask informed questions, but you will also learn how requirements, oversight, testing, monitoring, and human impacts fit together. If you approach the exam as a judgment test grounded in evidence and risk, the questions start to feel less random and more like a conversation with a thoughtful evaluator. That shift reduces stress and increases accuracy, which matters more than last-minute cramming. In the next episodes, We will build that mindset piece by piece until the domain tasks start to feel like a single, coherent workflow rather than a pile of disconnected facts.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.